Welcome everybody. My name is Ben Fitzsimmons. I am the Associate Director of Programs and Research at the Autry Museum of the American West. We'd like to acknowledge that the Autry is on the ancestral lands of the Tongva Gabrielino and recognize them along with their neighbors, the Chumash and Tataviam, as the traditional caretakers of this land. So tonight's discussion is of both a wonderful film, but also the larger issues of California's current environmental crisis from a Native perspective, including a discussion on waterways, forest management, and the tremendous untapped diversity of California's native food ecosystems. If you haven't yet seen the film Gather, it is available for viewing through tomorrow evening. A link is available on the Autry webpage for this event and in the registration email you received. It is also, I believe, available on Amazon and iTunes. So for tonight's event, there is a chat feature available for conversation with your fellow audience members. Please keep it respectful when using the chat box. However, please use the Q&A button to ask a question of our panel, as it is much easier for us to keep track of those questions during the program. And now I'll introduce the director of Gather, Sanjay Rawal. He is a James Beard Award-winning filmmaker whose first feature-length film, Food Chains, chronicled the battle of Oaxacan and Chiapan farm workers in Florida against the largest agribusiness conglomerates in the world. His most recent film, Gather, is a New York Times critic's pick, described as a documentary that wonderfully weaves personal stories with archival footage that contextualizes the continued violence against Native Americans. And I will now hand it over to Sanjay to introduce the other panelists and to begin the conversation. Thank you very much, everybody.
Ben, thank you very, very much for hosting us, and to the Autry Museum and to everyone who's joined. We'll keep this informal and fun and very conversational because our panelists have such a wealth of knowledge. I'm going to be getting them to share their deepest insights and their most profound secrets. So throw in your own comments into the chat box, throw in questions. In lieu of formal introductions, I'm going to be introducing them and bragging about them throughout the whole panel. But I'm going to begin with Sammy Gensaw, a California native from the Yurok tribe. Sammy, would you begin the panel in any way you feel comfortable, with a customary greeting or however you'd like to?
No, I'd just like to thank everybody for tuning in with us, and this opportunity to be here to have this discussion.
Sammy is from the Yurok tribe. He's up at the northern border of Oregon and California, and started a group called the Ancestral Guard. For those who've seen the movie Gather, they'll recognize Sammy and his group of boys and girls and young men and young women trying to rebuild their foodways. Sammy, how did you get into food sovereignty? And briefly, what were the first steps you took?
Well, when we talk about food sovereignty, what it really means to me, I was thinking about it the other day, and that's we're feeding our families and the people we love, and we're spending hours of our life to learn these skills, to make sure that our families can be fed, and to make sure that the practices that go along with eating these traditional foods are taught. So food sovereignty to me just means our ability to live our life and live it in a good way. But we use the food sovereignty to communicate with other people who might not understand exactly how important these resources and ability to feed ourselves actually is.
Thanks, Sammy. A-dae Briones is from the First Nations Development Institute, the premier philanthropic body working in Indian country. She's Kiowa and Cochiti and is now living in California. A-dae, can you give us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in the food movement?
Sure. And I think, yes, so I'm married into Big Valley Rancheria, and both of my kids are from Big Valley, as is my husband. And so I'm Kiowa and Cochiti. And I say that because, you know, in Cochiti ways, once you marry a man not from your village, you kind of have to follow him. So now I am serving the Big Valley people, but I think I'm like much of everybody else in California that we really should be serving Native Californian people. And I'm sure we'll get to all the reasons why. Um, but how did I get to this place where I work with food? So I work with indigenous communities across the mainland, Alaska, and Hawaii. And much like Sammy, you know, when people ask about food sovereignty or the food movement, it's a little weird, right? Because we don't always use those terms. Like indigenous people um, were created, we have communities that are centered around our food, and it's just a way of life. It's like your life ways. And so when people ask us about food sovereignty, it's like, wait, what does that mean again? And I don't think I interact with many people in indigenous communities who use that term. It's more like we're fishermen, we're hunters, we're corn growers. And so I came to this work much like Sammy. It was like a way of life. You learn these skills from your grandparents and your family, and it just becomes a natural part of who you are. And you don't realize how much that's threatened until you're outside of that community and you realize, you know what, there's dams that are like inhibiting the fish from growing, or you know what, there's so many pesticides in some of our grounds, our corn is not growing, or you know what, people are taking away our land, so we're not going to have the access to those lands. And you don't realize what food sovereignty means until a very basic understanding of who we are as indigenous people is threatened. And so I came to the work in that way. You know, there's a dam on my reservation. It was threatening our food and our way of life and generations of children. And so, like, I dedicated my life to food and indigenous people. That was
Thank
a
you.
good question, Sanjay.
That was perfect. I'm going to give everybody like a 1-minute micro explanation with some context. As people who watch the movie know, the earliest American economy was completely agricultural, completely land-based. When European colonizers, in this case, the Northern Europeans, the British first came to the East Coast, it wasn't wilderness. There were thousands of working native farms, very complex relationships cultivated by native peoples there, all destroyed to take their land. At the same time, by the 1700s, the Spanish began colonizing California and building a series of missions and rancherias through which they enslaved local natives under the pain of death. And they started large cattle operations, large farming operations. By 1848, California moved into the quote United States. And during that time, about half the tribes signed a treaty with the federal government. And they were given a gigantic plot of land across the Sierras, about 8.5% of California's land mass. They were moved off of their traditional lands. At the same time, the US Congress gave those lands to the public. But by the time they got to those effective Sierra Nevada reservations, they learned that actually they didn't learn this fact, but the California congressional delegation had forbade or blocked the US government from ratifying those treaties. So California natives who once occupied all of California signed deals for 8.5% of the land were effectively homeless. At the same time, California's first state legislative session passed something called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which effectively legalized the slavery and the murder of Native Californians. And so that's just the context of where we are right now. Sammy, in Gather, you say that by the time the state and federal government found the Yurok tribe, and you guys weren't part of that early treaty settlement, you guys were undiscovered, uncontacted effectively. But by the time they, quote, found you guys, they were through with treaties. Now, what was the impact of not having that federal recognition as a sovereign body? What was that like? And what were the ramifications throughout the subsequent generations of Yurok, Hupa, Karuk?
Well, the struggle that ensued after the effects of long-term genocide still linger in our communities and our ways of life today, and it's, you know, base of many problems that affect us on a daily basis. But what I can really tell is just from stories that are passed down through families, through, you know, oral histories that are shared, and through written contexts of earlier settlers, we can see when this process that America was using to, you know, pretty much remove indigenous people and lifeways from the land to completely take over and enforce their own culture. When this was happening, nobody expected indigenous people to live through that. You know, they were all with the mentality that it wasn't going to be indigenous people to deal with after this, and that we would just die out. Because once you rip, you know, culture from people, once you rip foodways from people, once you take, you know, land mass away from people, they didn't expect anything to survive that. But it was the resiliency of our ancestors living through those experiences and continuing to teach traditional values and stories and knowledge, and that built our societies that we're living in today. If you really look at the strength of these people that had to carry that through these generations, you know, I feel obligated to be able to provide healthy opportunities for my people to keep that work going. As my grandmother fought for indigenous people within education systems, and my other grandmother, my dad's side, fought for healthcare of California indigenous people. So that's where we find ourselves, right in the middle with these teachings, and then we hope to pass this on to future generations.
A-dae, so every single California tribe lost significant, if not all, portions of their ancestral land. You wrote an incredible article in Nonprofit Quarterly this month that traced that violence in part to the early environmental movement. Can you talk about the, quote, building of California's gold rush and agricultural economy, and how that tied in with John Muir and his cohorts, and to give a sense of why California natives are still in a precarious position?
Yes. So when we talk about like California history, we're talking about like the bulk of I feel like the bulk of what we're talking about are lingering residues from the late 1800s, like when gold was discovered in California. Even though there's all these horrible things that happened before that time, I think the important point is the discovery of gold in the late 1800s, and that wasn't very long ago. Like my great grandma was born in like 1879, and so we're still connected generationally, and so it's not law history that would happen such a long time ago. We're still connected to it. And the important part of that article was that a lot of American people see the environmental movement or the conservation movement as like a savior, right? Like they are the ones who are fighting for the rights of all Americans to access public lands and to protect our environment. But in reality, um, they didn't include indigenous people in the beginnings. They actually purposely excluded them because they wanted the places like the Redwood National Forest or the Yosemite National Park. They wanted, the Sierra Nevada, the Sierras, the Sequoia National Park. All these parks that were stewarded by indigenous people were so beautiful and so coveted that environmental conservation movement like John Muir and Joseph LeConte, the founders of these movements, actually not only kind of ignored all the genocide that was happening, encouraged genocide by US military, and also wrote them out of history. And so when you're writing an entire population out of history, the the genocide and the wrongs that happened to them sort of get written out too. And so when we're talking about stewarding homelands and stewarding lands, when we're talking about how indigenous people can contribute to fire, there is this subtle resistance to go that route because everything about them and their techniques have been written out. So now it's almost like we have to recreate and go back to those times when they were written out in order to figure out what we're missing. And it's like not only incredibly insulting at times, But it's really like unfortunate that a lot of Americans are missing this part of history of California. And California is a leader in a lot of the environmental movements. And when you think about California being the leader, and yet like some of the most prominent figures in this movement left out Indigenous people purposefully, it makes it incredibly hard for Indigenous people globally to make the arguments that we need to be included in management of these lands that have been taken away.
So the entirety of California's economy, including tech, is based on theft of land and theft of water. Everyone has seen the movie Chinatown. The theft of water was vital to creating the early fortunes of California that subsequently served as the capital to start tech and media and other conglomerates. The old California families go all the way back to the allotments in the 1850s and 1860s, where they basically hired soldiers to claim 160-acre plots that were effectively native lands. They congealed them all together, got water rights. Sammy, there's no place where water rights are clearer than, and the crime of diverting water is clearer than the Klamath and the Trinity rivers. The Trinity's basically shunted to funnel water to the northern part of the Central Valley. Talk about your opinions of Native stewardship over those waterways, the dropping of those dams, and how that's going to be better for California.
Well, first, what's happening in the Klamath Basin is what's going to set the example for the rest of the world, and how the United States government deals with not only Indigenous people, but American citizens when water becomes scarce. So what we're seeing a lot of is tactics that have been echoed throughout time. And what it makes me think of is even back in Brazil, how they're structuring, how they deal with their Indigenous people is how they originally dealt with Indigenous people here in America. So this system of genocide, it just continues to reverberate through Indigenous communities who, sit on a wealth of natural resources. So in the Klamath, it's the same exact scenario. We are having people that are diverting, 40 to 50%, or almost 60% of the Trinity River down south. And it's from the government, the federal government is doing this, and they take that water and they ship it to these private corporations. And then these private corporations are now using this water to build up a presence on the modern day stock market. So for instance, here in a couple months, they're trying to figure out a way how they can market stock for California water that comes from Indigenous peoples, the poorest communities in California, and is going into the pockets to keep billionaires within power and within resources and wealth. And not only themselves, but they're setting it up for whole new generations by buying their own scientists and setting up their own studies to find aquifers where they can store water for long-term use and for stock purposes. So it's no longer questions of what if, it's how, and what can we do as Indigenous people to make sure that these rivers are not just livable for salmon, because if a salmon cannot live in a river, then there's a high chance that humans can't live a healthy life along that river. And so when we lay these protections down, it's not only because we love these animals, which we do, and we understand their connection to the natural environment. It's that we understand that these protections are not only for these animals, but are people. And these protections might not be the EPA, because sometimes even the EPA up in our area is not holding these corporations responsible. And it's a government-led organization that's actually tearing Indigenous sovereignty apart. So when we're asked to lean on these systems that have been provided for us, they're actually taking sovereignty away from us. And you can look at that, what's going on in the middle of the country, in Oklahoma and all throughout their territories, how, their sovereignty has been stripped from them. Or if you look on how, Indigenous fishermen are being treated on the East Coast right now with their lobsters, and with those situations that's happening, if you look at it, it's all a systematic enforcement of keeping indigenous people as providers of natural resources, but also consumers of modern colonization, of modern, it's crazy, but it's what we're living with and what we're dealing with on a daily basis.
So it's
And
oh,
I'm
go
just
ahead,
going
A-dae.
to add to Tammy's comment, because I think there's right now we're like a critical point in our history of the world, right? We are in there's serious environmental issues and damages that are occurring. And what I'm hearing Sammy say is that, you know, indigenous people, we're connected to our foods. Sammy's talking about the salmon. Right now, there's so much information about regenerative agriculture, not recognizing that the reason like California is so fertile is because we're, like as Sammy said, we're literally sitting upon generations of salmon, right? The bodies would go up the river and they would float back down and they would end up on the banks. And you have incredibly fertile valleys because like dead salmon have created land that farmers now use to grow. And you know what? It's depleting. And how do you like regenerate something that's being depleted? You refuel it with what originally made it fertile, which is salmon. And so when we're talking about regenerative agriculture, which is all over the place right now, we can't talk about it without talking about indigenous people, altered natural waterways, the cutting down of some of our most precious trees that were stewarded and protected in like the Redwood National Forest, in the Sequoia National Forest. Like these are things indigenous people have been trying to protect for generations and have been like screaming alarm bells for a very long time. But for some reason people want to focus on like counting carbon when we're saying, you know what, people can't see carbon, but indigenous people know when a fish is healthy. We can tell you when the plant that is supposed to be growing, and probably the most like carbon sequestering plant, which are probably used to make baskets, is not growing here. Like indigenous people have figured out systems to read the earth. And you know, regenerative agriculture wants to call it carbon, but indigenous people are calling it a way of life. It's life ways. And so when we look at people who are talking about sequestering carbon, we also need to look at how much of that carbon is stored in the lands that indigenous people have stewarded. And the solution is not like getting more cows. The solution is giving more land back to indigenous people to steward and letting them steward the lands that they currently occupy. And so like we need to be listened to. And you know, we've probably been saying this for generations upon generations, but now if ever is the time that we should be listening to folks like Sammy.
So I want to get into that a little bit more. So it's clear that without free water, the Central Valley wouldn't have become the farming mecca that it is. And because that water is free, farmers are able to spend money on pesticides and fertilizers and have created an untenable situation where now those farmers need to adopt, quote, better practices that effectively are closer to what indigenous people practiced for thousands of years. But again, it's like the people whose ancestors created the problems are now trying to pose as leaders for a solution, whereas the knowledge is still there within indigenous communities. The water issues haven't hit top of mind in California metropolitan centers the way fire has. So can you guys talk about how painful and how ridiculous it is for indigenous people to see these systems breaking down, the forest stewardship systems breaking down, and federal and power authorities basically keeping natives off those lands and away from the tables for discussion?
You know, honestly, it doesn't surprise me. And that's sad that we've normalized not having access to our landways. We've normalized the government, you know, not listening to us. And, you know, we've also normalized, you know, stereotype saying that big cities are taking up a lot of the water that our fish need to survive. When in reality, if you look back on all the campaigns to save water, it's all put on the people. Limit watering your gardens, limit, the water you use in the city, and it's all pushed on the people. Well, in the background, over 50% of California's water is being misused by agricultural corporations. So the whole idea of placing responsibility of this problem in the hands of the people, American people, is the problem that does not allow us to find a solution. Because if we come together as fishermen and farmers within the basin, then there's enough water to support all of our lifestyles. But what there isn't enough water for is to support the funding of millionaires and to support the crops of millionaires who have no interest in putting resources back into our community, who have no interest in revitalizing the creeks that feed the river that our people depend on. There's so many opportunities that exist. The Yurok tribe is literally recrafting rivers and stream beds that has been decimated by logging practices. They are using machines that were designed to tear apart the earth. They're using these same machines and cats and everything to restore natural waterways. The solutions are there and they're available and they're being provided, but they're not being accessed.
And I would follow up by saying, like we have, people don't want to listen to our stories. So I'm going to take this opportunity to tell one now. And that is, when we were growing up, our grandparents would sit us down. And before we ate, we would have to give thanks. We would have to give thanks to not only our ancestors, the people who stewarded the lands before us, we had to give thanks to fire. We had to give thanks to water. We had to give thanks to the air we breathe, and we had to give thanks to the animal or the food that was on the table, and we had to give thanks to, um, our community. And when we did that, we were literally inviting those elements and those things to sit at the table with us. And as kids, like that was a common thing. Like it was a common thing to go outside and see a fire burning, whether it's a big one or a little. It was a common thing to walk to the stream. Like these things were part of our life. Now, when we look at society today, like we only appreciate water when it's in a pretty fountain, maybe. We only appreciate fire if it's like locked up and it's gas, it's propane. Like these are like elements that are essential to life that have been compartmentalized and sent somewhere else and only available when we call upon them, when in fact that simple act of sitting at the table to eat and giving thanks to all those things was our way of inviting them to our table. Because if you don't invite them to the table, you know what, they're going to get angry and they're going to come in with a vengeance to make sure that they are included. And that's what we're seeing like all across, when many of our environmental like worries come from the fact that we are not including them in our daily lives. That's like a very basic tenet of many Indigenous people. And the other thing is like when we think about the Central Valley, like Tulare Lake, for example, right? Used to, there's only one picture of Tulare Lake. It was probably the biggest lake in all of California. And there are so many tribes in the Central Valley that are not federally recognized by design. The reason they're not recognized is because they occupied some of the most fertile agricultural grounds in the world. And now, without federal recognition, they have no standing to make claims to those lakes. And in the meantime, they witness the draining of this lake. But there's so many basket weavers who come from Central California who can tell you, like, these plants are the plants that need to grow in this valley in order to secure water. And so many of the places where you see healthy, and they're very few streams in California Central Valley are places that are stewarded by indigenous basket weavers. And if that's not like regenerative agriculture, I don't know what is. They're doing it not because like somebody's paying them. They're doing it because again, it's their life way. Like we are connected to these lands, and no matter how degraded or drought ridden or fire burnt these lands are, like we're not going anywhere. Sammy's not going to go anywhere. Like, so like it's that important that we fight for these places because we're not moving. Like it can be a dry river, but we're not moving. That's like the purpose of why we exist, is to steward these places that were given to us by our creator. And so I I'll leave it there because I'm yeah.
Important question from Megan Masters, an attendee. What's the most important thing for an ally to know? What's the most important thing an ally can do? You want to take it first, Sammy?
Oh, yeah. An ally, what's the most important thing an ally can do? I mean, we cover a little bit about this in the film, and what we believe as members of the Ancestral Guard is that, all around the world, there's this thing happening called the Restorative Revolution that takes place within human beings because, like A-dae was saying, we feel a responsibility to take care of these places. And even if that riverbed's dry, we still have a responsibility to take care of these places. And we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that happens. Find the people who are making that change happen. Find the people who need the help. Don't don't just throw your money at any random organization that says they're doing, things for the people. Look for people who are actually making contributions that are helping communities grow. Look for organizations that you can donate your time to make sure that these goals are actually the goals of the people and not the goals of an organization that needs to achieve funding. So there's tons of things that you can do, and not as an ally, but as as a good person, as our friends say, be a good ancestor for your future children too. It's not just my responsibility to be a good ancestor for everybody. It's your responsibility too, because no matter what, somebody's one day is going to look to you um, for guidance. Someday somebody's going to look to your story to reflect on how they can, you know, go through their own life. And we don't have a choice, but we do have a choice to make sure that we leave healthy opportunities for the people we love. And we make sure that these opportunities are felt by the people we love. So, in short, do what you love, and hopefully that's helping people and doing good things.
And I would add that, there's this thing called land acknowledgements. It's all the vogue right now. And I find it fascinating that people are finally learning to say the names of the indigenous people who once occupied the lands they stand upon. Yay, that's wonderful. That's great. But I would ask allies to take it one step further and to think about how to give access to those indigenous people that once owned the land. It's one thing to do a land acknowledgement, but it's another thing to ensure that those indigenous people have access to their ancestral homelands. And the other thing is I would say indigenous people need to steward their lands. Like that is imperative. To me, that is one of the most simplest actions that we could do to heal our lands, to heal our world, and to heal each other. It's not a scary thing. It's only scary when you don't know an indigenous person or if you don't know about the fights. And so there's plenty of opportunities to learn about those things. And the last thing is I think as Americans, we're all told a very wrong history. Like 1492 is not when America started. And so we need to learn what the real history is and retell that to the kids who are coming up behind us, because it'll make the indigenous perspective make much more sense. Like right now, it's me and Sammy saying, wait, we've been doing this for a long time, because you know what, history, just like the conservation movement, wrote out indigenous people a long time ago. And so we're not only have to make the arguments for the current battles we're facing, we have to compensate for for all the history that wrote us out in the beginning. So that is so helpful if we just started telling the real history of this country.
A question for both of you, actually. When you're feeling down, when you're feeling like the road is just too difficult to travel, you know, the mountain too high to climb. How do you find strength?
Where's this mountain? Where's this road? I'm just kidding. No, and you know, it's Sanjay. I'm trying to live a good life, and that's what it's all about. You know, I'm trying to live a good life, and I'm trying to provide opportunities for the people around me who I love to live a good life. And there's obstacles when you want to do that. It takes sacrifice, and it's the bitterness of making that sacrifice that takes, you know, that makes the success of seeing your family do good things, you know, taste so good. If you really think about what's hindering indigenous people, like, you know, they was saying, it's we don't have access to our lands, we don't have, you know, proper access to our ceremonies, we don't definitely don't have proper access to our foodways. But, you know, waking up and being with your people for early morning hunt or early morning fishing trip, and, you know, that's something that we can all relate to. It's these things, these that create these neurological pathways that make us feel good about spending time with our family and doing the things we love, and, you know, feeding people, and not only feeding people, but, you know, praying for people and wishing good things. These things should be rewarded. But in today's modern American society, we are more likely to be punished for doing these things than we are rewarded. We're more likely to end up in a concrete cell or a box than we are, you know, in, in sharing this information with the people who need to hear it. So it's hard for me to just summarize it, but I feel like, yeah, it's hard. It's really hard when I think about it. I don't even know.
And I think one thing that Sammy touched on that I totally agree with, well, what gives me strength is that I I'm I'm on this panel and I'm talking to you, but really there are so many more brilliant indigenous people who will never be on the panel, who will never be in public, who will never write a paper. And those are some of the people that I get to interact with frequently. Those are people who like carry on our ceremonies, who live and breathe like indigenous foodways, and not like me who like have to take pause and come to a panel. There are some brilliant indigenous people out there, and you know, they may be the ones that may get caught up in the system. They may be the ones who will never leave like Cochiti ever, but they're brilliant, and it just makes me feel better knowing that there are so many more smarter indigenous people um, than me, of course, and that will carry this on. Like we're just one little hoop in a very long hoop. Like I'm carrying the burden now, but somebody else behind me is carrying going to carry the same burden. So I'm not ever alone. Even if I find myself as the only indigenous person, like I have my ancestors and they went through much harder times than I'm going through right now. And it's just nice knowing that I'm never ever alone.
Sammy, how can folks keep track of your work? How can folks contribute to your work? If folks are coming up to Yurok territory, you know, in our post-COVID world, what do they need to bring to be able to trade you for some of your salmon?
You know, that's a good question. What do you got? You know, come on through. If you don't got the COVID, you know, come through. And, you know, look, what we say, you know, we're really friendly people, and, you know, we're fishermen. We love to spend time on the river. If you want to know what we're up to, one thing you can do is follow the Undam the Klamath movement. And if that's one thing that you get from this is follow the Undam the Klamath movement, because the people within that movement are the people who've taught me and have allowed me to grow and be transferred from the fishing boat to in front of the Zoom camera. You know, it's just really look at us on Ancestral Guard. You can Google Sammy Gensaw. You can Google Ancestral Guard. You know, and also you can check us out on our website at Nature Rights Council, and also our Instagram, our Facebook. And this is Zeus, my brother's puppy. So, you know, This is what it is. We were out here. If you ever want to check out the Klamath River, we also give out redwood canoe tours in the spring, which will actually have people be able to get on the river, talk about the problems and talk about the history and talk about the great things. And we'll be able to show you why we love and fight for this place so hard.
A-dae, how can people learn about First Nations' work specifically in California? I know you guys are in the 574 tribal nations all over Turtle Island and beyond, and with a lot of unrecognized tribes, but California is special to you.
It is, and please visit First Nations. We have the California Tribal Fund, and it's run by an advisory board of Native Californian people throughout the state, from all the way from the south in San Diego County all the way to the northern border. And our primary purpose is, as Sammy said, is to make sure funding gets to the community groups that are doing work, right? Not the, and so we're guided by elders, traditional leaders, and people who are have their hands in the dirt or the water, so to speak. So the California Tribal Fund is at firstnations.org, and check us out.
Yeah.
Sammy, what's the future for Indigenous Californians?
It's probably gonna get a lot worse before it gets any better. I'll tell you that, right now. But what we have to look at is, I can't speak for all of Indigenous California because I don't know, and all I can really speak for are my people from my village and where I'm from on the Klamath River, and fishermen, and from a life that I understand, is that we are living in a world that is constantly changing and evolving, and we may do what we can to make sure that our life is good and make sure our life is long and our people are fed. But at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that we are part of this, earth. We're a piece of this planet. And to not acknowledge that is detrimental to your health, because then you stop thinking about what goes into your body. We need to start thinking better about, access to food for Indigenous people, because right now on the lower Klamath Reservation, we're technically a food desert. So when you ask me what do I see in the future, we didn't see that changing. So we had to step up and make those changes. We planted a huge garden to provide, for families on the lower Klamath River. We've just expanded that gardening problem to do home hugelkultur beds for 22 families, and it's a lot of work is what the future looks like for me. And it's a lot of coming together and acknowledging the differences that make us unique, and using those differences to build a stronger network of not only Indigenous people, but Americans and people from afar, to build a healthy generation of human beings. Because and that's what it's all about, is making sure that we can provide these opportunities for future generations. While and we have to fight. I've been fighting my whole life, and I don't see me stop fighting anytime soon. I don't see the fight stopping for my brothers. I don't see the fight stopping for A-dae. I don't see the fight stopping for our brothers and sisters in Brazil along the Xingu River, their river is being destroyed right now by dams. It's a lot of fighting, but through that fighting, I hope that we were able to find peace.
A-dae, I've as a non-native from afar, I've noticed that there is a very powerful matriarchal presence amongst California natives. And I know there's a lot of plans that aren't appropriate to be shared, but from that perspective, what does the future hold?
Most people don't understand where California got its name. There was this legend about like people in Europe going to this foreign land, and it was a land of Amazonian women. and this Amazonian women land had no men, and it was one of the most beautiful paradises in all of the world. And so that was the story of California, and I don't think it's far from a lie. Like, the California Native women are fierce. I'm raising one. Sammy can probably knows many of those
Many, many.
women in the
Yeah.
and like as long as California Native women exist, I think the fight, as Sammy said, will always continue on. Like, as long as there's one California Native woman alive, you know, there will be no sleep. You will be working. And I think that spirit says a lot about what our future holds, is that, you know, if you put resources and land and power into the hands of a California Native woman, we will all be surprised.
That's a huge and easy step for allies to support. A-dae, how can people start supporting that right now? Getting California Native women to the table and beyond.
Absolutely. Well, I think Sammy said, you know, he has an organization, Undam the Klamath. I know, no doubt that a lot of that movement is run by California Native women. I run the California Tribal Fund. The majority of our advisory board is California Native women, and my co-director is a California Native woman. Like, I think if you find any Indian organization in California, you will find a California Native woman who's brilliant and probably could use some assistance in getting into the places of influence that are not currently available. So if you have any influence at all, access to land, access to resources or political power, and you connect with one of these indigenous groups in California, I think there'll be natural connections.
Sammy, any last words for us on this panel? Anything that people should think about, or anything you just want to say to wrap us up?
I've noticed that we're doing this for the Autry Museum, and one thing I want to say too is that you know, we have to acknowledge, as a lot of people, they're scared to acknowledge their past, and they're scared to, talk about the true histories because it brings up so much pain. Well, they just need to understand that historical trauma is felt on both sides of colonization, and it's okay to have these conversations. And as a museum, we have to ask ourselves: are these museums put here to preserve indigenous culture, or do the people at these museums, are they allowing indigenous people to access to these things? Or are they trying to make sure that these cultures are living on? Or are they trying to preserve, artifacts of something that doesn't exist anymore? And the mentality is so different. We have to start acknowledging that even if your system or your legacy or your history has roots in colonization, your future doesn't have to have roots in colonization. And this museum, I hope they're doing what's right with what they have, to make sure that indigenous people and communities are thriving. Because one thing that I really wish is that I know that people respect indigenous knowledge, and I know people respect indigenous things and ancient things, but are they respecting indigenous people? Do they have the same respect and love for indigenous people? That's a question that we need to ask. And if the answer is yes, then how are we showing it? Because land acknowledgement is great, but it's only the beginning, and it's not good enough anymore. We need to make sure that we're taking on a piece of that burden and taking on a piece of that pain, because from somebody who's lived it my whole life, it gets easier.
A-dae, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I think Gather was dedicated to my grandmother, and you'll see it at the end of, and the question about women really speaks to the current situation we're in. When we look at agriculture today and we see tables and tables of one sex and probably of one race. Like, we should be questioning who needs to be at the table. And as a mother of a California Native woman, I think we need to see more California Native in every space that occupies any type of conversation about land stewardship, water, and agriculture. And I think, like, I can't make that happen. I can try, but I need the entire public to make that happen. So I invite that conversation, and I hope that is like a prediction and prophecy for our future.
A-dae, Sammy, I know that if COVID hadn't hit so hard and Gather was out in theaters, it would have been wonderful in many ways, but I can't imagine having had as much time to spend with you guys as we now get to have on these Zoom calls. So I want to really thank you for your time. I want to thank all of those who watched the panel live and all of those who are going to watch the recording of the panel online. Of course, Ben at the Autry, the entire Autry family, and all the folks that want to learn more about Gather and First Nations and the Ancestral Guard. We're online and everybody is ready and willing to be of service. So thank you guys very, very much. Have a great night and a great weekend.
You too. Thank you.
The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.